Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Laik Siddiqui, the father of Holophase. Let us continue our journey from where we left off in previous part. Phi Pattern Science, the complete foundation. Part 1. Why Phi pattern must be the starting point of a new science. Before we begin, a small invitation. This part is about something so basic that we almost never notice it. It is not a story that begins with equations. It does not begin with atoms, stars, or brains. It does not begin with religion, philosophy, or physics. It begins with a simple human act you perform every day. You notice a difference. You notice that one sound is not another. One face is not another. One moment is not another. One thing changed. One thing stayed the same. That act seems small. It is not small. This whole chapter is built around one profound claim. Before we can speak of objects, laws, measurements, meanings, or observers, we must already have pattern. And if that is true, then pattern is not decoration. Pattern is not a side topic. Pattern is not a visual hobby. Pattern is the starting point. This part has one job: to make that inversion clear, rigorous, and impossible to unsee. The ordinary assumption we rarely question. Imagine you are walking through a forest. You see trees. You see leaves moving in the wind. You hear birds. You notice sunlight falling in stripes through branches. Then, suddenly, you see a deer standing still between two trees. What did you just see? Most people will say, I saw objects. A tree is an object. A deer is an object. A branch is an object. The world is made of things, and those things sometimes form patterns. That is the ordinary picture. It feels natural. It feels obvious. In that picture, pattern is secondary. Pattern is what happens after objects exist. Pattern is the arrangement of things, not the basis of things. So we say, the deer has a pattern on its coat. The leaves make a pattern in the wind. The shadows form a pattern on the ground. Pattern sounds like decoration. Interesting, yes. Beautiful, yes. But not fundamental. This is the object's first worldview. It is so deeply built into language that we usually do not even realize we are assuming it. But now comes the question that changes everything. The problem hidden inside common sense. How did you know it was a deer? Pause there. How did you know it was not a shadow, a bush, a rock, a broken branch, or a trick of the light? You knew because of pattern. You recognized the shape. You recognized the relation between parts. You noticed a certain posture. You noticed tension and stillness. You saw coherence across color, form, and position. That is pattern. Without pattern, deer never appears. You do not first see an object and then add pattern. You first detect structure difference, and from that, the object becomes identifiable. This is the foundational inversion. Pattern is not built on top of objecthood. Objecthood is built out of pattern legibility. In simpler words, you do not get to think without first getting to pattern. This does not make the deer unreal. It makes your understanding deeper. The deer is still there, but what makes the deer publicly identifiable is not thingness alone. It is a stable, readable pattern. This is the first doorway into Phi pattern science. Testing the inversion against other worldviews. Maybe you agree that objects depend on pattern, but someone may say, fine, maybe objects depend on pattern, But surely laws come first. Let's test that. The law-first worldview. In a law-first worldview, reality is governed by laws. Gravity, electromagnetism, thermodynamics, quantum laws, conservation laws. These are treated as fundamental. Everything else comes later. But what is a law in practice? A law is a stable statement about repeatable structure. A law says, in effect, when conditions are like this, outcomes are constrained like that. That means a law already presupposes comparability, repeatability, recognizable sameness and difference, stable relations across cases. All of that is pattern. Before you can state a law, you must already be able to recognize the two situations are comparable in some relevant way. If you cannot identify patterns across cases, you cannot even form a law. So laws do not come before pattern. Laws are pattern statements. They are disciplined claims about what pattern structures can coexist and transform lawfully. So the law-first worldview, when examined carefully, also presupposes pattern. The observer-first worldview. Another person may say, no, the observer comes first. Reality is built through observation, perception, or consciousness. Let us test that too. What is an observer? At minimum, an observer is something that can detect difference, register change, compare states, preserve traces, and act on those distinctions. But each of those abilities already depends on pattern. To observe is to distinguish. To distinguish is to track structure difference. To track structure difference is pattern work. So the observer is not outside pattern. The observer is a pattern system participating in pattern reality. Observation is not prior to pattern. Observation is one form of pattern activity. This is a crucial protection against confusion. Phi pattern science does not deny observers. It simply refuses to treat them as magical exceptions. Observers are real, but they are not external to the world of pattern. They are inside it. The foundational inversion. Now we can state the inversion clearly. You cannot start a public science from objects alone, because objects must be identified. You cannot start from laws alone, because laws require comparable structure. You cannot start from observers alone, because observers detect through pattern. So what must come first? Pattern, as publicly comparable structure, must be foundational. This is not a poetic preference, it is a structural necessity. Pattern is what must already be available for anything to become identifiable, comparable, shareable, testable, and knowable. In Phi pattern science, this is the first and most important move. We are not saying patterns are useful, we are saying something stronger. Pattern is the condition of public intelligibility itself. That phrase matters. Public intelligibility means what can be known together, checked together, discussed together, and carried across observers, tools, and generations. If something cannot enter public comparability, it has not yet entered public science. So pattern is not merely what we notice. Pattern is what makes public noticing possible at all. Why everyday pattern talk is not enough. At this point, someone may say, but we already have the word pattern. Why invent a whole science? Because everyday pattern talk is too weak, too vague, and too unstable to carry a foundational science. Let's be honest about how we usually use the word. It is often subjective. We say, I feel there is a pattern. It seems like a pattern to me. But a feeling is not a public criterion. Another person may feel differently. Science needs more than personal intuition. It is often visual only. We think pattern means stripes, spirals, repeating shapes, decorative motifs. But patterns also exist in time, rhythms, behavior, habits, language, grammar, relationships, networks, thought, reasoning structure, measurement, signal regularity, and transformation, how things change. A foundational science cannot be trapped in visual bias. 3. It is often vague. Where does pattern begin? Where does noise end? When is a coincidence just a coincidence? What counts as the same pattern? Everyday language rarely gives rigorous criteria. 4. It is unstable across observers. One person sees pattern, another sees randomness, a third sees a different pattern in the same evidence. Without discipline, pattern talk becomes argument without a shared test. 5. It is vulnerable to projection. Humans are powerful pattern recognizers, but we are also powerful pattern projectors. We see what we expect. We see what we fear. We see what flatters our beliefs. Without safeguards, we can mistake preference for pattern. That is why 5-pattern science needs a stricter foundation. What a scientific concept of pattern must do. If pattern is going to be foundational, the concept must be strong enough for science. It must be public, not a private feeling only. It must be shareable across observers. Testable. Others must be able to check whether the pattern claim holds. Replayable. The path to the claim must be retraceable, not just the conclusion asserted. Auditable. Hidden choices must be inspectable, otherwise artifacts can masquerade as pattern. Scoped. The claim must say where it holds and where it stops. Uncertainty honest. It must declare limits, not pretend certainty. Anti-smuggling hardened. No hidden assumptions, hidden pre-processing, hidden boundaries, or hidden definitions of same pattern. In other words, a real science of pattern needs discipline. Not discipline to make it bureaucratic. Discipline to keep it honest. A glimpse of the protected center. At the heart of 5-pattern science is one protected act. This is the act the whole framework exists to serve and protect. The lawful public certification of 5-pattern invariants and their lawful transformations. Let's make that simple. Lawful means done under declared rules, not hidden choices. Public means shareable and checkable. Certification means disciplined judgment, not mere impression. It stays the same through allowed changes. Transformation means how patterns change while keeping identity, or how identity breaks and something new appears. This protected act is the center because every science eventually depends on it. To do science, we must be able to say, this pattern is really there, within scope. This is what stays stable. This is what changed. This is how we know, and this is how someone else can check. Everything else in the broader holophase infrastructure, constitutions, companions, workflows, audits, archives, exists to protect this act, not replace it. Protect it. The thesis of Part 1. We can now state the Part 1 thesis in full form. Public reality is readable as lawful phi pattern structure. This is stronger than saying patterns are useful descriptions. It is stronger than saying the world contains patterns. It says reality, in its public aspect, the aspect that can be known, compared, and certified, is structured as pattern all the way down. This does not deny physics. It recenters physics. It does not deny objects. It reinterprets objecthood. It does not deny laws. It reframes laws as stable pattern constraints. It does not deny observers. It includes observers as recursive pattern systems. So this is not destruction, it is refoundation. A story across the scales of the universe. To feel how deep this goes, let's look across scales. Cosmic scale. Galaxies do not sit randomly like marbles in a box. They form filaments, sheets, clusters, and voids. That large-scale organization is pattern, not decoration, structure. Stellar scale. A star's life depends on structured relations: mass, pressure, fusion rate, temperature, stability. Those relations are pattern constraints. The star is a stabilized process pattern. Planetary scale. River networks branch, storm systems spiral, seasons cycle, tides repeat. These are not just events, they are pattern transformations. Biological scale. A leaf veins itself, a shell spirals, a heart beats rhythmically. DNA sequences build living forms. Life is not a pile of matter. It is matter organized as persistent, adaptive pattern. Human scale. Language has rhythm, grammar, and meaning structure. Music has motif, variation, return. A friendship has repeated interaction patterns. A society has institutions, incentives, and memory systems. Human life is saturated with pattern. Microscopic scale. Crystals repeat lattice structure. Proteins fold into constrained forms. Cells regulate patterned exchanges. Quantum scale. Interference, resonance, standing modes, transition structure, again, pattern. Pattern is not one local feature of one domain. Pattern is the condition through which all domains become publicly readable. The exact forms differ, the scales differ, the windows differ, but the need for pattern remains. That is why a science of pattern is not a side project. It is a foundational project. The rigor spine for part 1. Now, let us make the rigor explicit, but in simple language. Part 1 is not yet doing formal mathematics. It is laying foundations. Even so, it must obey discipline. Part 1 mandate. This part exists to establish the inversion. Pattern is foundational to public science. It must not yet define phi mathematically, import physics primitives, pretend to prove empirical predictions. This is a foundational framing part. Core claim type. The claim here is a foundational structural thesis, not a predictive claim. That matters because different claim types require different tests. Part 1 is not making a numerical forecast. It is installing the architecture that later parts will formalize. Scope. This part is about the conceptual architecture of public science. What must be true for any public science to begin? Early gates. Preview form. Even in part 1, we preview the discipline that will later become formal gates. Well-formedness. Are we speaking clearly or only poetically? Type discipline. Are we clear this is a foundational claim, not an empirical one? Are we secretly importing objects, laws, or observers as primitives while claiming pattern first? Scope honesty. Are we saying what this part establishes and what it does not yet establish? Identity separation. Are we avoiding confusion between the pattern itself and our descriptions of it? Part 1 introduces these in spirit. Later parts will formalize them. Firewalls for part 1. What this part must protect against. A foundational chapter is dangerous if it is misunderstood, so part 1 must build firewalls. Firewall 1. Pattern is not just visual decoration. If pattern is reduced to stripes and shapes, the foundation collapses. Firewall 2. Pattern is not whatever humans interpret. If pattern is made purely subjective, public science collapses. Firewall 3. Pattern is not only statistical output. Statistics can help read patterns, but pattern is not identical to a statistical method. Firewall 4. Pattern is not post hoc language on top of objects. If objects remain primitive and pattern is added later, the inversion has not happened. Firewall 5. Pattern is not poetic metaphor only. This framework must remain scientifically buildable, not merely inspiring. These firewalls matter because most confusion enters right here, at the first door. What part 1 must produce before we can move on? A good foundational part should leave behind clear outputs. By the end of part 1, the reader should be able to hold these certified conceptual outputs. 1. Pattern first readiness. They understand why pattern can be foundational. 2. Need for a primitive root. If pattern is foundational, there must be a more primitive condition that makes pattern possible. 3. Need for publicness discipline. Private pattern impressions are not enough for science. Need for future rigor. The reader is ready for invariance, windows, scope, uncertainty, and anti-smuggling protections later. Protected center orientation. They understand that the framework is ultimately built to protect lawful public certification. If these outputs are not achieved, moving forward too fast creates confusion later. Refusal conditions. When part 1 fails. A rigorous framework must know how to refuse bad progression. Part 1 should refuse progression if it collapses into any of the following. Pure metaphor. If the whole part becomes beautiful language without operational meaning, it fails. Aesthetic manifesto. If pattern is treated only as beauty, harmony, or spiritual mood without public criteria, it fails. Anti-object rhetoric only. If the part attacks objects-first thinking, but offers no constructive pattern-first foundation, it fails. Hidden smuggling. If objecthood, lawhood, or observer privilege is quietly imported as primitive while claiming pattern first, it fails. Vague patternism. If pattern remains undefined in spirit, just a fashionable word for everything, it fails. Refusal here is not harshness, it is discipline. A weak part 1 poisons everything downstream. A strong part 1 protects the entire canon. Why this beginning is deeper than it looks. Some people may read this and think, this is only philosophy of science. No, it is more than that. This part is not merely asking how we talk about reality. It is asking what must be structurally available for reality to become publicly knowable at all. That is deeper than method and earlier than theory. It is the ground on which method and theory stand. If this ground is unclear, later equations become fragile. If this ground is discipline, later formalisms become powerful. That is why part 1 must be both simple and rigorous. Simple enough for anyone to enter, rigorous enough to carry the weight of the whole structure. The bridge to part 2. Now a new question becomes unavoidable. If pattern is truly foundational, then what is the most primitive condition that makes any pattern possible? What must be true before there can be sameness and difference, comparability, relation, public legibility? We have not answered that yet. We have only shown why we must ask it. Part 2 begins there. Part 2 will introduce the primitive permission for distinction, the root condition from which pattern can arise. In the language of this framework, that root will be named phi. So part 1 ends not with a finished system, but with a necessary doorway. If pattern comes first, then comparability must come before pattern structure. And that is where the science truly begins. Part 1. Summary in plain language. Here is the whole chapter in one clear compression. We usually think objects come first and patterns come later. But when we look carefully, we discover we cannot identify any object without already using pattern. The same is true for laws and observers. Laws require repeatable, comparable structure. Observers detect through structure differences. So pattern must be more fundamental than objects, laws, or observers in any public science. But everyday pattern talk is too vague, too subjective, and too vulnerable to projection. So we need the disciplined science of pattern: public, testable, replayable, and anti-smuggling. This science is centered on one protected act: the lawful public certification of pattern invariants and their lawful transformations. And the central thesis of this first part is: public reality is readable as lawful phi pattern structure. That is the first inversion. That is the foundation. That is why pattern must be the starting point of a new science. Canonical handoff prompt to Part 2. Part 1 has established the necessity of a pattern-first foundation. Part 2 must now establish the primitive root condition that makes pattern possible at all: primitive comparability. Always, peace be upon you.